Motocross in the mid-1970s was pure chaos, dust clouds, roaring engines, and young riders pushing machines to their absolute limits. And into this explosive moment arrived the 1974 Suzuki R125, a motorcycle that didn't just compete, it completely changed what was possible on a dirt track. Before it, riders had to wrench endlessly on converted trail bikes, hoping to make them fast and light enough to survive a moto. Suddenly, here was a purpose-built weapon straight from the factory, slim, aggressive, and engineered for one thing only: domination. The stakes weren't just about winning trophies, they were about redefining motocross as a sport, turning it from a patchwork of garage experiments into a true battlefield of precision-built machines. And that's why the 1974 Suzuki RM125 holds a special place in history, because it became the first widely accessible production motocrosser that gave everyday riders the chance to feel like professionals. If you stood at the edge of a track that year, the buzz of an R125 flying by didn't sound like just another bike. It sounded like the future arriving at full throttle. In this story, we're going to trace how that single machine came to be, why it mattered so much, and what happened after it set the motocross world on fire. So hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives, and let me know in the comments which legendary machine you want to explore next. The 1974 Suzuki RM125 didn't appear out of nowhere. It emerged from a motocross scene that was already hungry for something radical. In just a few years, the sport had exploded in America, with riders young and old carving up makeshift tracks and demanding motorcycles that could handle both brutal acceleration and bone-rattling jumps. At the time, most options were either heavy, underpowered, or cobbled together from off-the-shelf trail bikes. Into that gap, Suzuki poured its racing know-how, distilled from factory efforts in Europe and Japan, and produced a bike that brought professional-level design straight to the average rider's garage. The RM125 promised a new standard of performance, but the question was whether it could deliver on tracks filled with seasoned competitors. The story begins with a closer look at how this breakthrough was made possible, and why the 1974 RM125 became an instant benchmark. Micro story: a racer's dream in a crate. Imagine being a teenager in 1974, saving every penny to buy a bike that wouldn't need endless modifications just to line up at the starting gate. You opened the crate, rolled out a Suzuki R125, and realized it was ready to race from day one. No need to strip off heavy lighting gear, no need to upgrade suspension, no hours lost to rejetting just to keep it alive. The RM125 came with long travel forks, lightweight design, and a motor that screamed for competition. For riders who'd spent years trying to compete on hand-built hybrids, this was liberation. For the first time, a motocross machine felt like it was built just for you, and it changed the psychology of ownership forever. Context Digest: what set the stage? In the early 1970s, motocross in America was still a young sport, imported from Europe but taking on its own culture. Races were wild, often hosted on rough farmland, with riders improvising both style and equipment. Manufacturers had been slow to adapt, leaving racers to do their own conversions. But the hunger for lightweight, high-revving two-strokes was obvious, and Suzuki recognized that the first brand to give riders exactly what they wanted could win not only on the track, but also in the showroom. Micro story: the factory pipeline. Suzuki's R125 drew directly from the works machines that had already been tested in European Grand Prix competition. Engineers took what champions had ridden, simplified it for production, and created something ordinary buyers could access. This was not a watered-down trail bike. It was a distilled version of the winning formula. Riders immediately noticed the difference. Agile, sharp, and brutally responsive, it carried the DNA of professional racing straight into local motocross tracks. For competitors who had only dreamed of touching factory-level performance, the 125 made that dream tangible. Reflection bridge. That connection between factory and everyday rider is what gave the 125 its magic, and it explains why it immediately disrupted the balance of the motocross scene. Micro story: the sensation on debut. When the RM125 hit American tracks, it didn't take long before everyone noticed the yellow flash out front. Riders who had never seen the podium suddenly found themselves leading motos, all thanks to a machine that didn't hold them back. Rival bikes were heavier, slower to respond, and less forgiving in corners. The Suzuki's nimbleness wasn't just mechanical, It became psychological ammunition, giving riders confidence to push harder than ever. In an instant, the playing field tilted toward anyone lucky enough to throw a leg over one. Context, digest. Engineering choices that mattered. The R125's power-to-weight ratio was its secret weapon. By keeping the frame light and the two-stroke motor fierce, Suzuki delivered explosive acceleration without sacrificing control. Suspension travel, still a developing area in the mid-1970s, was ahead of its time, giving riders the ability to absorb bumps that would have rattled their rivals. It was a combination that turned brutal tracks into manageable battlegrounds, making stamina and skill the deciding factors instead of sheer mechanical luck. Reflection bridge. Those choices weren't just smart engineering. They created a ripple effect, forcing every competitor in the industry to rethink what a motocross bike should be. Micro story, owning one in America. The R125 didn't just dominate races, it dominated garages. Riders who bought one found that maintaining the bike was simpler than their old cobbled-together machines. Parts availability, straight from Suzuki's growing dealer network, meant less downtime and more track time. Friends who had struggled to keep trail-based conversions running suddenly found themselves chasing someone who could spend all weekend racing instead of wrenching. The R125 wasn't just a bike, it was freedom from frustration, and that became part of its legend. Context digest, the cultural wave. By 1974, motocross had become more than just racing, it was a lifestyle. Magazines featured young riders, events drew massive crowds, and the R125 slotted perfectly into this cultural boom. It wasn't just a machine. It was a symbol that the sport had matured, offering tools designed for competition rather than improvisation. For a generation of riders, the R125 wasn't just an option, it was the benchmark, micro-story. The intimidation factor. Rival riders didn't need to look at the results sheet to know the R125 had arrived. They felt it on the track, watching yellow bikes cut inside lines and blast out of corners with a ferocity that was hard to match. It created a psychological arms race, with competitors scrambling to figure out whether their skills or their machines were suddenly obsolete. The R125 didn't just win races. It rewired how people thought about motocross competition itself. Context digest. Why timing was perfect. The 1974 release coincided with motocross reaching critical mass in America. Families were loading bikes onto trailers, local tracks were springing up everywhere, and demand for real race-ready machines was surging. Had Suzuki released the R125 a few years earlier, the audience might not have been ready. A few years later, the market would have been crowded with imitators. Instead, it hit at exactly the right moment, locking in its place as a defining machine of its time. Reflection bridge, that perfect storm of timing. Technology and rider hunger is what made the 1974 Suzuki RM125 unforgettable. And it set the stage for even bigger shifts to come. The story of how this bike not only conquered the tracks, but also reshaped the entire motocross landscape continues, with the ripple effects it created in the years that followed. The 1974 Suzuki RM125 had already proven itself as a groundbreaking machine. But the real story came in the ripple effects it unleashed across motocross culture. Within a single season, riders who had once struggled at the back of the pack were suddenly competitive, and local racing scenes across America saw a wave of newcomers confident enough to sign up simply because they could buy a machine that didn't handicap them from the start. The R125 changed the very definition of fairness in motocross, not because it leveled the playing field, but because it raised the bar so high that everyone else had to catch up. That escalation is what makes this chapter of the story so compelling. Micro-story, the shock to rivals. When other manufacturers saw the 125's immediate dominance, they scrambled to respond. Their existing machines were heavier, less agile, and rooted in older thinking. The Suzuki showed what modern motocross engineering could be, forcing everyone else into catch-up mode. Riders who had been loyal to other brands began jumping ship, creating a visible shift in brand loyalty at the local level. It was more than just one bike winning races. It was an entire company seizing the momentum of a sport. Context digest. Why escalation mattered. Motocross was in a phase of rapid growth, and whoever led the technology race would shape the sport itself. The R125's influence went beyond performance. It dictated the expectations of young riders entering the sport. If a new competitor couldn't offer the same level of speed, agility, and durability, it wasn't even considered. That pressure drove the entire industry to evolve faster than it might have otherwise. Microstory: the rider's confidence. For a teenage racer in 1975, lining up against bigger bikes and older competitors could be intimidating, but the R125 changed that dynamic. Suddenly, riders felt that their machine could go toe-to-toe with anyone. It wasn't just horsepower, it was the combination of nimble handling, quick acceleration, and the psychological boost of knowing you had the best tool in the paddock. That confidence translated into bolder riding, faster lap times, and often, surprise victories. Reflection bridge. When confidence meets engineering, it creates a cultural shift that goes beyond the racetrack. Microstory: the aftermarket boom. Because the R125 was so widely adopted, it sparked a cottage industry of aftermarket parts, tuning kits, and performance tweaks. Riders who wanted to squeeze even more speed out of their machines suddenly had options, and shops that once focused on generic trail bike mods now specialized in RM upgrades. The bike didn't just fuel competition on the track, it fueled an entire economy around motocross, giving mechanics, dealers, and parts makers a reason to expand. Context digest: the training effect. With the R125 raising the standard, riders had to improve their fitness and technique to fully harness the machine. It wasn't enough to simply own one, you had to master it. Tracks became more technical, jumps grew larger, and training programs became more serious. The R125 didn't just change the bikes. It changed the riders themselves, forcing a new level of athleticism and commitment. Microstory: stories from the grassroots. In small-town America, families who had never thought of motocross as more than a weekend hobby began to invest more deeply because of the R125. The bike made competition feel accessible, and local tracks saw more sign-ups and packed starting gates. Kids who might have dropped out after struggling on outdated machines now had a path to progress, and entire communities felt the sport gain legitimacy as a result. Reflection bridge: the cultural penetration of the R125 was as significant as its engineering. And that combination is what turned it from just a motorcycle into a movement. Microstory: the intimidation on a national level. As the R125 gained traction, national-level races were suddenly dominated by swarms of yellow bikes. The sight of so many identical machines charging into the first corner created an aura of inevitability. Competitors knew they weren't just racing other riders, they were racing against the R125 itself. That kind of dominance isn't common in motorsport, and it cemented the bike's reputation as the defining machine of its era. Context digest: why the industry couldn't ignore it. Within 2 years, the influence of the R125 was visible in every rival's product lineup. Lightweight frames, improved suspension, and sharper two-strokes became the norm because no company could afford to fall behind. The R125 had essentially reset the rules of engagement, creating a new baseline for what motocross machines had to deliver. In that sense, the bike wasn't just a product, it was a catalyst. Microstory: living with one long term. Owners discovered that while the R125 was built for racing, it was also surprisingly reliable compared to the constant tinkering earlier bikes required. This made it attractive not only to competitive riders, but also to enthusiasts who just wanted a weekend thrill without spending all week in the garage. The machine created a broader spectrum of motocross riders, from serious racers to casual thrill seekers, all united by the same core experience. Reflection bridge. This broad appeal ensured the R125's influence extended well beyond its production year, shaping how motocross would grow for the next decade. The escalation brought on by the 1974 Suzuki RM125 wasn't just a matter of speed or engineering, it was about changing the culture of motocross and the expectations of riders worldwide, setting the stage for the lasting legacy that followed. The 1974 Suzuki RM125 had already transformed motocross in its debut and forced rivals into a new arms race, but the true measure of its importance lies in the legacy it left behind. This machine was more than a flash of dominance. It became the blueprint for what a motocross bike should be. Riders who cut their teeth on the RM125 carried those lessons into later decades. and entire generations of machines bore its DNA. To understand why it's remembered with such reverence, we need to look at how its impact continued to ripple through both the sport and the ownership experience long after that first yellow flash appeared at the starting gate. Micro story. The gateway to professional racing. For many young Americans, the R125 was their first taste of serious motocross competition. Riders who would go on to professional careers often started on this very bike, gaining skills that lesser machines would never have allowed. The R125 wasn't just an introduction. It was a stepping stone, teaching control, aggression, and strategy on a platform that demanded precision. Without it, many riders might never have reached the heights they eventually achieved. Context digest. The democratization of speed. Before the R125, elite performance was the domain of factory teams and heavily modified bikes. After it, that performance became something you could buy off the showroom floor. This shift wasn't just mechanical, it was cultural. It meant that motocross was no longer a niche for the mechanically gifted. It was a sport open to anyone willing to throw a leg over a bike and learn to ride it hard. That democratization changed the trajectory of motocross in America. Micro story, family stories of ownership. The R125 didn't just live in race results. It lived in the memories of families who hauled it to local tracks every weekend. Dads tuning the carburetor, moms packing food for the day, siblings cheering from the sidelines. It became a centerpiece of countless American motocross stories. Even decades later, those who owned one remember not just the wins or the losses, but the sense of belonging it created. The R125 was a ticket into a community, and that's why it's remembered with such affection. Reflection bridge. That blend of technical achievement and emotional connection is what elevates the 1974 Suzuki RM125 from a good motorcycle to a cultural milestone. Micro story. The collector's perspective. Today, original 1974 RM125s are highly sought after by collectors, not just because they're rare, but because they represent a turning point in motocross history. Restoring one is like preserving a piece of racing evolution. Owners talk about the thrill of hearing that sharp two-stroke crackle again, not just as nostalgia, but as a reminder of how far the sport has come. These machines, even when parked in a garage, carry a living legacy. Context digest. Influence on design philosophy. The success of the RM125 pushed design priorities across the industry toward lighter, sharper, race-focused machines. That philosophy remains intact today, visible in every modern motocross bike. The lessons learned in 1974 about weight distribution, suspension travel, and responsive power delivery still guide engineers, proving that the RM125 wasn't just a product of its time, but a foundation for the future. Micro story. A lasting symbol. For riders who experienced motocross in the 1970s, the sight of that yellow tank became an emblem of possibility. It meant that with the right bike and enough courage, you could compete at a higher level than you ever imagined. Long after the dust settled, the 125 remained in memory not just as a motorcycle, but as a symbol of ambition, freedom, and the thrill of chasing speed. Reflection bridge. This is why the R125 isn't just remembered by those who rode it, but by the entire sport it helped to redefine. Micro story. A modern echo. Even today, when younger riders hear stories about the 1974 R125, they're struck by how much influence one bike could have. In a world of constant updates and yearly model changes, it's rare for a single machine to stand out across decades. Yet the R125 continues to be a reference point, a reminder that sometimes one bold move can alter the course of an entire industry. That recognition cements its place not only in history books, but also in the imagination of new generations. Context digest. Why legacy matters. For any motorcycle, legacy is measured not just in wins, but in the way it shapes what comes after. The R125's legacy is clear. It defined the expectations of riders, forced competitors to innovate, and helped transform motocross into a mainstream sport in America. Its fingerprints are still visible in the machines tearing up tracks today, which is why enthusiasts continue to honor it half a century later. Reflection bridge. The R125's story closes not with its production run, but with its lasting presence in culture and memory. The 1974 Suzuki R125 wasn't just a bike that won races. It was a machine that redefined motocross, shaped the sport's culture, and left a legacy that still echoes every time a lightweight two-stroke roars to life. That enduring influence is what makes it one of the most important motorcycles ever built, and why it continues to be celebrated as the motocross machine that truly ruled the tracks. Looking back at the 1974 Suzuki RM125, it's clear this wasn't just another motorcycle release. It was a moment where motocross itself pivoted into a new era. The R125 delivered something the sport had never seen before: professional-level performance in a package accessible to everyday riders. That accessibility redefined what ownership meant, because it wasn't only about having a machine that could win races. It was about being part of a movement where motocross became faster, sharper, and more democratic. For American riders in particular, the R125 represented freedom from the compromises of modified trail bikes, and it opened the door for thousands of newcomers to experience true motocross for the first time. The impact went beyond the track. Families began investing weekends and resources into local racing, because the R125 made competition feel attainable, and with it came a stronger motocross culture nationwide. Collectors today still chase original 1974 models not just for their rarity, but for the story they embody, a story of how one bike reshaped a sport. Engineers continue to cite the lessons of weight reduction, responsive two-stroke power, and long-travel suspension that the R125 popularized. And riders, whether they competed professionally or just rode for the thrill of it, carry vivid memories of the machine that finally gave them the confidence to ride harder and aim higher. For US viewers, the so what is simple. The 125 proved that when a manufacturer truly listens to riders and delivers without compromise, the entire culture of a sport can change. It showed that great machines don't just serve their owners, they serve as catalysts for growth, competition, and inspiration. The R125's blueprint continues to live on in every race-ready motocrosser built since, making it not just a relic of the past but a benchmark for the future. In the end, the 1974 Suzuki RM125 was more than a motorcycle. It was the motocross machine that ruled the tracks, rewrote the rules, and left behind a legacy that still roars today.